There exists, across the civilized galaxies, a truth so fundamental that even the most primitive species understand it within their first generation of sentience. When darkness falls, you go inside. The predators own the night. This isn't philosophy or cultural bias, it's basic mathematics written in blood and evolutionary pressure across 10,000 worlds. The Vrinthians learned it when their ancestors tried building settlements near the Crimson Valleys, where the Shade Stalkers hunted. 43 colonies vanished before they accepted the obvious. The Keltorians, with all their technological pride, still seal their habitation domes at dusk on their homeworld because the Dusk Runners have infrared vision and pack-hunting instincts that make mockery of individual intelligence. Even the Zephrani, who fly and theoretically could just leave whenever threatened, constructed their entire civilization in the canopy layer specifically to avoid the ground-level carnivores that emerge when the sun set. It's not cowardice, it's not even really fear, although fear certainly plays its motivational role. It's simple acknowledgement of reality. Evolution spent millions of years designing things that kill in the dark, and civilization's response was to invent walls, doors, and the revolutionary concept of not being where those things are. Any species that didn't figure this out became a cautionary tale in someone else's biology textbooks, usually in the chapter about extinction events and poor decision-making. So when the survey mission to Valdris IV began cataloguing the local ecosystem, nobody questioned the protocols. Observation during daylight hours, return to the fortified research outpost before the sun touched the horizon. Simple, sensible, survival-oriented. Valdris IV, as it turned out, had taken the nighttime predator concept and decided to get creative with it. The planet was a surveyor's nightmare wrapped in a xenobiologist's fever dream, covered in forests that seemed designed by a committee of sadists with a fondness for gothic horror. The trees grew in twisted spirals, their bark covered in thorns that wept acidic sap. The underbrush rustled with things that had too many legs and not enough regard for personal boundaries. And the canopy was thick enough to turn daytime into gloomy twilight and nighttime into you might as well be in a cave, except caves don't have things that want to eat you this badly. Then there were the thornback ravagers, apex predators the xenobiology report called them, which was rather like calling a singularity a bit dense. These things stood 2 meters at the shoulder, with 6 legs ending in claws that could shred plasteel, armored hides covered in bone protrusions that gave them their name, and a hunting strategy based on pack coordination that suggested uncomfortable levels of intelligence. They were nocturnal, naturally because the universe has a sense of dramatic timing, and they were territorial in the way that volcanoes are warm intensely, violently, and with little patience for negotiation. The research outpost, built by the Crithians who crewed this particular expedition, reflected their species' practical approach to survival. Walls that could withstand small artillery, sensor grids that detected heat signatures from 2 kilometers out, and enough defensive weaponry to hold off a small army. The Crithians, insectoid beings with excellent pattern recognition and a cultural emphasis on not dying stupidly, had surveyed 47 hostile worlds without losing a single team member. They were good at this, which made their reaction to the humans' proposal all the more entertaining. Extended field research, the human had said, as casually as one might suggest, trying a new beverage. I want to establish a monitoring camp in the forest. Get some close-up behavioral data on the ravagers. The Crithians' translator struggled with the clicking sounds that followed, but the meaning came through clearly enough. Absolutely not. Commander Thexic, whose shell bore the scars of 4 decades of survey missions, had attempted reason first. The thornback ravagers are most active at night. Our sensors indicate pack sizes of 8 to 12 individuals. Their hunting range encompasses the entire forest sector you're proposing. Right, the human had nodded, making notes on a datapad. That's why it's perfect for observation. Perfect for observation, the exec repeated slowly, or perfect for becoming observation data in someone else's study of predator-feeding behaviors. The human had smiled at that, which the Crithians had learned to recognize as the expression their species made when they were about to do something inadvisable. I'll be fine. Humans have been camping in predator territories for thousands of years. Your species, another crew member interjected, has also been dying in predator territories for thousands of years. The two facts are related, but humans, as the Crithians were learning, possessed a peculiar combination of traits: selective hearing when it came to warnings, optimism that bordered on delusion, and a contract that technically gave them autonomy over their own research parameters. The human was going into the forest, and short of physical restraint, which raised its own diplomatic complications, there was little they could do about it. So they watched. They watched through microdrones as the human trekked into a clearing roughly 3 kilometers from the outpost, far enough to be in prime ravager territory, close enough that they could theoretically retrieve the body before scavengers got to it. They watched as the human began setup, and that's when the concerns evolved from worried to deeply confused. The human didn't deploy any of the standard defensive equipment: no energy barriers, no sonic deterrents, no plasma fence generators. Instead, the human gathered wood, dead branches, fallen logs, dried brush, combustible material piled with what seemed like deliberate care in the center of the clearing. "Is that for a funeral pyre?" one observer asked. "I think," the exec said slowly, "that's for before death, not after." Then came the traps. Primitive things, sharpened stakes concealed in shallow pits, tripwires connected to logs suspended in the trees, snares woven from synthetic fiber. The kind of defenses that wouldn't have looked out of place 10,000 years ago on any pre-industrial world. The Crithians watched with the fascination of scientists observing behavior that violated all established patterns. "Perhaps," someone suggested hopefully, "this is a human religious ritual, preparation for the afterlife." The human, oblivious to the mounting existential crisis happening 3 kilometers away, erected a simple shelter, fabric stretched over a basic frame, open on one side toward the clearing. Not sealed, not armored, barely enough to stop rain, let alone teeth and claws. Then the human sat down and began sorting through supplies, humming something that the audio pickups identified as music, though its purpose in this context remained unclear. The sun began its descent. The forest, already gloomy, transformed into something that belonged in a nightmare. Shadows pooled between the trees like liquid darkness. The ambient sounds of daytime creatures ceased with an abruptness that suggested they knew something the human apparently didn't. The temperature dropped 6 degrees in as many minutes, and the human lit the fire. The reaction in the outpost was immediate and loud. Flames leaped up from the prepared wood, casting dancing light across the clearing, making shadows twist and jump at the tree line. Every Crithian instinct screamed about the wrongness of this. Fire meant light, yes, but it also meant noise, smell, advertisement of position. Fire announced to everything within visual range, "Here is something warm-blooded and vulnerable, come and get it." "We need to extract now," someone declared. The human explicitly refused extraction protocols, except in case of injury. The exec reminded them, mandibles clicking with agitation. "We're legally bound to honor that." "There's going to be injury," Significant injury. Fatal injury. Through the drone feeds, they watched the human do something even more incomprehensible. The human produced rations from a pack, heated them over the fire, and began eating. Just sitting there. In the open, backlit by flames, having dinner like this was a perfectly reasonable scenario. "I can't watch this," one of the junior researchers announced, covering their optical sensors. "Tell me when it's over." It took 47 minutes for the Ravagers to arrive. The sensors picked up their heat signatures long before visual confirmation. 8 of them, moving through the forest with the coordinated precision of experienced hunters. They approached from multiple directions, a textbook encirclement pattern, staying just beyond the firelight's reach. The Crithians held their collective breath, which was purely psychological, since they didn't breathe the same way, but the sentiment remained. The Ravagers stopped. All 8 of them, frozen at the edge of the darkness, their eyes reflecting the firelight in shades of silver and gold. They watched the human. The human, incredibly, watched them back while taking another bite of whatever constituted human field rations. Minutes passed. The predators shifted, communicated through subsonic rumbles that the sensors translated into pack coordination signals. They were assessing, strategizing. This wasn't normal prey behavior. Normal prey ran, or hid, or at least had the decency to look frightened. This thing sat in the open, surrounded by light, radiating confidence that had no logical basis. One of the Ravagers, either braver or stupider than its packmates, crept forward. It moved with the cautious intensity of a creature that knew it was the apex predator but had encountered something confusing. 2 meters into the firelight's reach, it triggered the first trap. The log, suspended with careful attention to angles and force, swung down with physics-backed inevitability. It caught the Ravager in the shoulder with a crack that the audio pickups registered clearly. The creature shrieked, a sound somewhere between rage and genuine surprise, and scrambled backward into its packmates. The human, and this was the part that would haunt Thexic's dreams for cycles, didn't even flinch. Just moved slightly closer to the fire, added another log to keep the flames high, and continued eating. The Ravagers regrouped, their subsonic communication increasing in frequency and intensity. They tried twice more, different angles, more cautious approaches. One hit a stake pit and limped away with a punctured paw. Another got tangled in a snare and had to be freed by its packmates, while making sounds that translated roughly to undignified frustration. By the time the smallest moon rose above the canopy, the Ravagers had withdrawn to just beyond sensor range, and the human was banking the fire for the night. Preparing for sleep, the observation team reported, as if saying it out loud might make it make sense. The human arranged a sleeping roll, positioned it near enough to the fire for warmth, but far enough to avoid sparks, and laid down. Within minutes, the biomonitors confirmed what seemed impossible. The human had fallen asleep. Actually, genuinely, fully asleep, complete with the regular breathing patterns and decreased heart rate that indicated real rest. "I have theories," one xenobiologist announced into the stunned silence, "and I hate all of them." The Crithian crew maintained watch through the entire night, rotating shifts because apparently someone needed to stay awake, even if the human thought otherwise. The Ravagers returned twice more, once at the darkest hour before dawn, once just as the first light began touching the canopy. Both times, they tested the perimeter. Both times, they encountered either fire, traps, or the truly disturbing sight of a creature that refused to acknowledge it should be prey. Both times, they left. When dawn broke, the human woke, stretched in a manner that suggested restful sleep rather than trauma, and began the day by checking the traps and rekindling the fire for what appeared to be a morning beverage. The transmission that came through to the outpost was cheerful. Day 1 successful. The Ravagers are curious but cautious. I'm going to reinforce the eastern perimeter today. They seemed most interested in that approach vector. Talk later. The channel closed, leaving the Crithians to contemplate their existence and choices. Day 2 followed the same pattern, except the human expanded the defensive perimeter and added what could only be described as psychological warfare to the arsenal. Scarecrows fashioned from spare clothes and equipment, positioned at intervals around the camp. They didn't look particularly human, but they looked like something, and in the firelight, they created the illusion of multiple figures. The Ravagers approached with noticeably more caution. One of them actually fled when a scarecrow's arm, shifted by wind, moved suddenly. Day 3 brought improvements to the traps. Better triggers, more coverage, positioning that suggested the human had studied the Ravagers' movement patterns and adapted accordingly. One Ravager, particularly persistent or particularly dim, triggered the same snare twice in the same night. The human, monitoring from the shelter, made what the audio sensors identified as laughing sounds. By day 4, the Ravagers' approach attempts had decreased by 60%. They still circled the camp, still marked it as part of their territory, but their behavior had shifted from hunting prey to something closer to avoiding that weird thing with the fire and the terrible attitude. Day 5 saw local wildlife beginning to adapt. Smaller creatures, apparently deciding that anywhere the Ravagers avoided must be safe, started appearing in the clearing during daylight hours. The human documented this with evident satisfaction, noting that the camp had effectively become a safe zone in the middle of hostile territory, through nothing more than aggressive defense and refusal to acknowledge the established food chain. By day 6, other Ravager packs had learned to route around the clearing entirely. The humans' biomonitors showed increasingly regular sleep patterns, suggesting adaptation and comfort. The camp had evolved from desperate survival setup to something approaching permanent establishment, complete with organized supply storage and what might generously be called landscaping. Day 7, the human added insult to injury by constructing a drying rack for laundry, hanging it between 2 trees at the clearing's edge, like this was a casual camping trip rather than an extended stay in what the Crithians had classified as a high mortality zone. The research data was excellent. The xenobiology reports were comprehensive. The behavioral observations of thornback Ravagers encountering something that refused to be prey would be valuable for decades. But the real education was happening in the outpost, where the Crithians had begun pulling up human historical records with the queasy fascination of people discovering their comfortable assumptions had been built on sand. They call it camping. One researcher reported, optical sensors wide with disbelief. This is a recreational activity for them. They do this for fun. That can't be right. The exec said, check the translation matrix. Translation is accurate. Humans regularly venture into predator territories on their homeworld, establish temporary settlements, and spend nights there voluntarily. It's considered relaxing. Relaxing. The word choice is confirmed. They found records of human persistence hunting, a strategy that involved following prey for days until it collapsed from exhaustion. Records of early humans driving megafauna off cliffs through coordinated effort and patience. Evidence that humans had climbed to the top of Earth's food chain, not through superior strength or speed, but through stubbornness, tool use, and an apparent unwillingness to accept that anything might be better at surviving than they were. They don't have natural weapons, someone noted. No claws, no armor, no venom. Their pursuit predators that turned environmental manipulation into a survival strategy. So when this human built traps and lit fires, that's just what they do, that's what they've always done. We thought it was desperation. It's actually just baseline behavior. The implications settled over the crew like a particularly uncomfortable gravity field. They'd been traveling with a human for 3 standard cycles, eating meals with the human, sharing workspace, and none of them had quite processed that their colleague belonged to a species that had conquered their planet, not by being the strongest or fastest, but by being too stubborn to die, and creative enough to make that everyone else's problem. Should we be concerned? Someone asked quietly. The exec considered the question while watching the drone feed of the human, currently sitting peacefully by the fire, updating research notes while something that could kill with casual ease circled beyond the light's reach. The human has been nothing but professional and cooperative. Yes, but we've been operating under the assumption that humans are fragile and need protection. They do need protection. Look at them, no natural defenses at all. No, the Siki said slowly, watching the human add another log to the fire with practiced ease. They have defenses. We just didn't recognize them as such because we were looking for claws and armor instead of fire and ingenuity. On day 8, the human transmitted a request to extend the study another week. The Ravagers, the report noted, were exhibiting fascinating avoidance behaviors and long-term adaptation patterns. The camp had become a de facto sanctuary for smaller species. The data was unprecedented. The Crithians approved the extension. What else were they going to do? Tell the human it was too dangerous. They'd been saying that since day 1, and the human had responded by taking a nap in a forest that made hardened survey veterans nervous. On day 12, something unexpected happened. A juvenile Ravager, inexperienced and probably hungry, attempted a direct assault on the camp. It charged through 2 trap lines, accepting the injuries as costs of commitment, and made it to the fire line before the human could react. The Crithians, monitoring with sudden sharp attention, prepared to launch the emergency extraction team they'd kept on standby since this madness began. The human grabbed a burning branch from the fire and thrust it directly at the Ravager's face while making sounds that the translators struggled with before settling on aggressive shouting. The Ravager, confronted with something that not only refused to run but actively fought back with fire as a weapon, made a decision that spoke to some deep instinctive wisdom. It left, quickly, with what might charitably be called haste. The human, adrenaline clearly active based on the biomonitors, laughed, actually laughed, then reinforced the inner perimeter and went back to taking notes, as if defending against a direct predator assault was just another item on the day's checklist. "I want to go home," one of the observers announced. "I want to go back to surveying nice predictable worlds with normal dangers that make sense." "Define normal," the Siki muttered, watching the human test trap tensions with the casual air of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. The remainder of the extended study period passed without major incident, which itself was remarkable. The Ravagers had learned. They'd genuinely, measurably learned that the clearing with the fire and the stubborn bipedal creature was not worth the effort. They adjusted their territorial ranges. They modified their hunting patterns. They, apex predators of Valdris IV's forests, adapted their behavior around a single human who'd decided that evolution's carefully crafted food chain was more of a suggestion than a rule. When the human finally packed up camp on day 19, the clearing looked almost civilized. The fire pit was properly constructed, the trap lines were clearly marked for future researchers, and there was even a rough log bench positioned for optimal viewing of the forest. The human had turned a survival situation into something approaching comfort through nothing more than determination and applied knowledge. The return to the outpost was triumphant, at least from the human's perspective. The data collection was comprehensive, the observations were detailed, and the human seemed genuinely pleased with how everything had gone. The Crithians greeted their colleague with the complicated feelings of people who'd spent nearly 3 weeks certain they were about to witness a tragedy, only to discover they'd been worried about the wrong party. "Excellent work," the Gexic offered, because what else could one say? "Thanks. The Ravagers are fascinating once you understand their behavior patterns. Very intelligent, very adaptive. I think with a few more studies, we could really develop a comprehensive picture of their social structure." "More studies," someone repeated faintly. "Oh yes, I was thinking next time we could try deeper in their territory, maybe near the canyon systems where the larger packs operate." The silence that followed was profound. The human, oblivious or perhaps just accustomed to this reaction, headed off to compile the official reports, leaving the Crithians to their thoughts. Those thoughts, compiled over the following days as the data was processed and analyzed, formed a picture that would eventually make its way into xenobiology databases across the civilized galaxies. Humans, the reports noted, were a species that had evolved on a world classified as a death world by any reasonable standard: high gravity, extreme weather variations, and a biosphere that seemed actively hostile to sustained life. They had no natural weapons, no armor, no specialized predatory features. What they had was endurance, pattern recognition, tool use, and an apparently unshakable conviction that any problem could be solved through applied stubbornness. They had mastered fire before they'd mastered agriculture. They'd hunted creatures 10 times their size through persistence and coordination. They'd looked at the night, at the darkness that every other species learned to fear, and decided that what it really needed was proper lighting and some boundary enforcement. They were, the reports concluded with the dry tone of scientists who'd had their worldview thoroughly reorganized, not to be underestimated based on appearance. Their danger came not from natural weapons, but from their complete refusal to accept limitations. They didn't conquer through force, they conquered through the stubborn application of intelligence and the unsettling ability to simply not acknowledge when they should be afraid. The Thornback Ravagers, for their part, went on with their lives. They hunted their usual prey, maintained their territorial ranges, and ruled the forests of Valdris Forth as they always had. But in one particular clearing, 3 kilometers from where the strange bipedal creatures had established their outpost, the Ravagers learned to root around. The trees there still bore marks from the traps. The fire pit remained, cold now but present, and on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the branches and created sounds that might almost be like voices, the Ravagers would pause, remember, and choose different hunting grounds. Across the galaxies, the universal truth remained: when darkness falls, sensible species go inside. Predators own the night. This is fundamental, unchangeable, written in the evolutionary code of survival. Humans, as it turned out, had never been good at reading the instructions. They'd looked at the night, at the predators, at the carefully established rules of survival, and responded with fire, ingenuity, and the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested they hadn't realized they were supposed to be afraid. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Not because humans were stronger, or faster, or more dangerous than the things that hunted in the dark, but because they'd spent millennia figuring out how to make the darkness irrelevant, the predators manageable, and their own vulnerability just another problem with a practical solution. The night might belong to the predators, but humans had apparently decided that was more of a zoning suggestion than actual ownership. And in that gap between what should be and what humans decided would be instead, lay the kind of survival strategy that made every other species in the galaxy reconsider their assumptions. Commander Thexic, filing the final mission reports, added a personal note to the humans' evaluation: exceptional field research capabilities. Recommend for future high-risk survey missions. Also recommend warning other species before assigning them to work with humans. They should know what they're getting into. It seemed only fair. After all, the night might belong to the beasts, but someone should probably tell the beasts that humans hadn't gotten that memo, and at this point, they probably wouldn't care if they had.